Days of Revolt, I think. Can they bring it up? I'll give it back.
Raise the microphone, please.
Okay. So I wrote a book a few years ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. That book came out of an experience I had my final year at Harvard Divinity School with the great ethicist James Luther Adams. He was 80 and emeritus, but each year he would take 2 seniors, of which I was one, and do a British-style tutorial for the year where we would talk about resistance with a theological vocabulary. Adams had been in Germany. He was bilingual in 1935 and 1936 at the University of Heidelberg, where he watched Heidegger begin the lectures with a Nazi salute. Disgusted by the failure of German academia, and as you heard, I teach at Princeton, and I can promise you it's just as bad here, to defy the Nazi menace, he dropped out and he joined the Confessing Church, the underground anti-Nazi church led by Niemöller, Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, Schweitzer, until he was picked up by the Gestapo and deported. And when he left Germany, he had packed into his suitcase home movie rolls, film, of not only the meetings of the Confessing Church, but the so-called German Christian Church, which fused the iconography and language of the state with the iconography and language of the Christian religion. And he put 2 portraits of Adolf Hitler over that film so that when the border guards opened up his suitcase and saw the pictures of the Führer, they closed it back up and he was able to smuggle that film out of Germany. I watched hours of that home movie film that he had taken in Germany as he narrated. And he told us that when we were his age, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. Because when you de-industrialized a country and threw your working class into poverty and despair, and when you allowed for the rise of a religious movement that sacralized nationalism, you created a recipe for fascism. If the Nazis took over America tomorrow, he told us, I can assure you 60% of the Harvard faculty would gleefully begin their lectures with a Nazi salute. That's his quote. We are at an extremely dangerous moment in American history. We stand on the precipice of, at best, an authoritarian and probably a fascist state. And we on the left bear significant responsibility for what has happened. We lost our radicalism. We lost our militancy. We forgot about justice. We became infected with the discourse of neoliberalism, which is a utopian ideology, as utopian as any other ideology that has beset the 20th and 21st century, from communism to fascism. The idea that the dictates of the marketplace should somehow determine how you run your society is utopian, and I use the word as Thomas More coined it, utopian meaning no place. The idea that neoliberalism would expand democracy, that it would create, by enriching the top 1%, a middle class, that trade agreements would somehow benefit working men and women, that deregulation was an engine to economic prosperity. All of these were lies that Adams understood. Shortly before he died, I went out with a film crew. It was funded by the Lannan Foundation to interview our most important contemporary political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, who taught at Berkeley and later at Princeton. That 3-hour interview with Sheldon is on YouTube. Wolin, in the 1980s, called out neoliberalism for the con game that it was, became a pariah within the political science department at Princeton, wrote his great book, Democracy Incorporated, which certainly gave me the vocabulary to understand the devastation that has been visited upon us. Wolin talked about the transformation of American society beginning in the early 1970s by corporate forces that reacted to what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called an excess of democracy. Lewis Powell's memo, 1971, the attack on the free enterprise system, became the blueprint. And in that memo, the one person Powell names pariah is Ralph Nader, who, when we look back on this period of history, will certainly rank as one of the most magnificent and courageous Americans. No one has been fighting corporate power, and nobody understands corporate power better than Ralph. And what did those centers of power do? But use the tremendous resources of capitalism to destroy the media, to destroy academia, and to destroy those organizations and movements that gave us our democracy. It wasn't the founding fathers, as Howard Zinn amply points out in The People's History of the United States. The founding fathers carried out a counter-revolution on the part of the white aristocratic slave-holding elite. I teach in a prison. I'm teaching a course now at Edna Mann, where half of my students are Princeton undergraduates. And the game you play with the prison administration is that you write your synopsis of the course. It's the opposite of writing a course for a college catalog that makes it look absolutely banal and boring. And the greatest con I ever played on the New Jersey Department of Corrections was my proposal to teach American history, the three branches of government, the founding fathers, and then, when it was approved, give every one of my students Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. I never met Zinn, tragically. I always admired him. But in that prison classroom, I realized what an exceptional historian and intellectual he was. Because throughout that book, Zinn is deeply cognizant, as anyone who studies American history must be, of the African American experience. And these were mostly African American students who had never been taught their own history. And I would give my 90-minute talks, and I would hear my students, not George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton, who does not deserve a Broadway play, being the father of American capitalism and American imperialism. We had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered. Tens of thousands were blacklisted. The evolution of the slave patrols became the Klan, became the Pinkertons, became the Baldwin Felts, became the gun thugs. And as Zinn correctly pointed out, the expansion of our democracy was carried out by groups that never achieved formal positions of power. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, and let's not forget the communists and the anarchists and the socialists. These were the forces that at times paid with their lives to create democratic space. And of course, the last great movement being the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement of the 1960s. They did what I think we today in the left have failed to do. And that is to understand that power is always the problem. That we who care about justice have to understand that we will always stand in opposition to power, no matter who holds power. Politics is a game of fear. And if we do not make the power elites afraid, we fail. Appealing to the better nature of the power elites is a waste of time because it doesn't have a better nature. There's a moment in Kissinger's memoirs, don't buy the book, where it's, I think, 1971, and there's a gigantic anti-war demonstration, tens of thousands of people. And Nixon, to protect the White House, has put empty city buses in a ring all the way around the property. And he's looking out the window, wringing his hands, going, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that is just where we want people in power.
Yeah.
We have to recover our moral force and our moral voice. As Julian Benda understood in The Treason of the Intellectuals, we have a choice in life. We can choose two sets of principles: justice and truth, or privilege and power. But the more we make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more we diminish the capacity for justice and truth. That assault, what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism, and as he correctly points out, there are no institutions left in this country that can be considered authentically democratic. That assault gave us a liberal elite that embraced the destructive force of neoliberalism and diverted the left into boutique activism, multiculturalism, gender identity, none of which I'm against, of course, but which are sterile and self-serving when divorced from justice. And while that left was engaged in those pursuits, neoliberalism was destroying the lives of primarily poor people of color in our deindustrialized centers. And it was only with the rise of the Occupy movement, and I spent significant amounts of time in Zuccotti Park, when white, middle-class, college-educated kids went out into the workforce burdened by a debt peonage that is deeply familiar to any African American, because debt peonage is a form of social control. Realized that there was no place for them, confronted the reality of police violence. They began to ask the questions we should have asked a long time ago, when these were the reality for our poor. Neoliberalism flipped all of the great liberation ideas and movements of the 1960s. The great feminist, Andrea Dworkin. Feminism was about empowering oppressed women, not about electing a woman president or a woman CEO. Racial justice was about lifting up the lives of people of color, not electing, as Cornel West called Barack Obama, a black mascot for Wall Street. And that faux liberal class embodied by the presidency of Bill Clinton set us on the road to the demagogue Donald Trump. Because Clinton spoke in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism while thrusting a knife into the back of working men and women and making war on black and brown people.
Right.
NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. The 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which exploded the prison population during the Clinton administration from 700,000 to 2 million. And those not only were sentences doubled, tripled, and quadrupled, not only were people imprisoned for nonviolent crime, but huge amounts of resources, military resources, were given to our police to turn marginal communities, internal colonies, into brutal and lethal police states, where police can kill unarmed citizens with impunity, as they are doing now, 3.1 people a day. And where was the left? Where was the liberal class? Why were they silent? Where was the church? The theologian James Cone, our most important theologian, wrote a book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. This is his last book, in which he looked at lynching in the South and defined it for what it was: crucifixion. The crucifixion of black bodies and black children. And he asked that question: where was the white church? Where were the white theologians? Why did they say nothing? Why could they not see the crucifixion when it was in front of them? I asked Cone, he once described the white church as the Antichrist. I asked him a few months ago, do you still describe the white church as the Antichrist? He said, well, if you define the Antichrist as everything that Jesus came to fight against, I would have to say yes. Neoliberalism has infected the church just as it has infected the liberal elites. We speak in its language. We are devoured by its poison. We have been taught to trust in systems of power we should have long stood up and defied. The damage done by the Clintons was immense, furthered under Bush and furthered under Barack Obama. And that's why there has been complete continuity in the major structural issues as well as the imperial projects for the last 3 decades. Although I would have to say Obama's assault on civil liberties was worse. Not only giving the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens through a misinterpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act, but as you heard, the overturning of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which prohibited the military from acting as a domestic police force. Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, for which I went to federal court to sue Obama, allows the military to detain, without due process, any American citizen who supports the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or associated forces, whatever that is, and hold that citizen until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which in an age of endless war is forever. In essence, to carry out acts of extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities. And in that 2-year legal process, as it went to the Second Circuit, the appellate court, The lawyers approached the Democratic leadership in the House, because this section is renewed every year, and said, all you have to do is to insert that this does not apply to U.S. citizens, and we will drop the suit. But they did not, because it was written for U.S. citizens. We have undergone, as John Ralston Saul correctly says, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over. Anytime you give rise to a bankrupt liberalism, this is what Dostoevsky wrote about in The Idiot, or in The Underground Man, Notes from the Underground. Anytime that you create a liberal elite, whether it's in Weimar or Yugoslavia, which I covered, that mouths the words of traditional liberalism but refuses to defend or stand for any of those beliefs, you create not only an economic and a political crisis, but an existential crisis. And what happens, as Richard Rorty writes in his last book, Achieving Our Country, is that when that cabal, in this case corporate cabal, seizes power, when that corporate cabal keeps the facade of democracy, electoral politics, the Constitution, but internally has seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent, then what you foster is a governmental paralysis, an inability on the part of the government to respond to the most basic rights and needs of its citizenry. That's how you get a bailout, where the people who committed financial fraud are bailed out and the victims are left to pay for it. What happens is what has happened to us. Finally, you have internally large groups of the disenfranchised who turn on a bankrupt liberal elite, as we saw in this last election. This has nothing to do, by the way, with Russia. This is just another form of ridiculous demagoguery on the part of the liberal class. Think about it. Think about what they're telling you. Really what they're saying is tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Hillary Clinton supporters woke up, read the John Podesta emails and said, that's it, I'm voting for Trump. Or, and I take the 7 pages written in the National Director's Intelligence Report, they watched RT and decided to vote for the Green Party. You have neoliberal Republicans who demonize Muslims, undocumented workers, and you have neoliberal Democrats who demonize Putin and the FBI director. The elites are pitting alternative facts against alternative facts and failing to confront or name the economic and ideological forces that have disemboweled the United States. And what happened, courtesy of that bankrupt liberal class, was that huge numbers of dislocated, largely white, working class Americans whose pain is real and whose betrayal is real turned on not only those liberal elites, but the purported liberal values that they said they stood for. I watched the same thing in Yugoslavia. It's what happened in Weimar. When you create that kind of a dysfunctional system, you vomit up figures like Donald Trump, or Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, or the buffoons in the Nazi Party. And all of them were buffoonish. Some of them, like Trump, or Goring, or Milosevic, or Karadzic, out of power, can actually be quite funny. But that doesn't in any way mitigate the fact that in power they are immensely dangerous. That 40-year period of neoliberalism, where those forces that acted as a check on despotic power, the courts, which have been stacked with corporatist lawyers, including by the Obama administration, the press, that because Clinton deregulated the FCC is concentrated in the hands of roughly a half dozen corporations: Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. The fact that we now socially find Fox News an acceptable news outlet. And finally, the universities were purged, especially in the economics departments. If you didn't sing to the tune of neoliberalism, you were never going to get appointed and never get tenure. Any tyranny makes war on institutions such as labor unions, civic organizations, opposition, anti-war movements, anything that gives a voice to those out of power, but particularly targets three institutions within the society: the courts, the press, and academia. Because in a functioning democracy, those are the last arbiters of truth. Those are the institutions that can keep a democracy rooted in verifiable fact. And when you discredit and destroy those institutions, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, then fact and opinion merge. Fact becomes whatever it is you want to believe. "49% of Americans find Trump trustworthy. 39% find the press trustworthy." I think that's a Merrimack poll. And we on the left, who I think we have to acknowledge in a form of self-criticism, have surrendered the moral authority we should have had by backing a Democratic Party we should have long ago defied. Must find the temerity and the courage to denounce not only the most retrograde forces of American capitalism that have now seized power, but also a gutless and dishonest liberal elite. It is extremely important as this country devolves that there be voices that speak out on behalf of working men and women, that speak out on behalf of the poor, that speak out on the 2.2 or 2.3 million human beings who go to bed every night in this country in a cage, that defy the centers of power, that recognize that it is not our job to take power, but to build movements that keep power in check. Karl Marx wrote that in the final stage of capitalism, when capitalist expansion could no longer generate the kinds of profits that it accrued in the past, it would begin to devour its host. It would begin to consume the very structures that allowed it to exist. And that is the stage of late capitalism that Trump represents. In every department. The education budget will be turned over to for-profit corporate schools and the Christian right. Intelligence is already outsourced. 70 Bose, Allen Hamilton, 99% of its budget comes from the government. The rise of mercenary forces, contractors. I was in Standing Rock. And getting into Standing Rock, we passed through private contractor checkpoint after private contractor checkpoint, and they were all carrying long-barreled weapons. And Trump has empowered those institutions and entities that always buttress and hold up a fascist state. Internal security, with its militarized police, and the military. He has unleashed whatever tepid restraints were put on the fossil fuel industry, Wall Street. And what we are seeing is, and this happens in the twilight of any empire, a naked kleptocracy, not just by his family, which will certainly become rich, but by these corporate forces that will pillage the country and the ecosystem without restraint until exhaustion or collapse. And there are no internal forces now that can stop it. It's up to us, and it means going into the street, and it means disrupting the machinery of governance, as we saw with the Muslim travel ban at the protests in the airports. Because what did those protests do? They shut down those airports.
Yeah.
Those of us who come out of a faith tradition have to recognize that at this moment in history, resistance is a moral imperative, and it doesn't matter whether we win. I don't fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. I'm going to close with a short passage from my book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. And this passage was when Dr. Cornel West and I, in Zuccotti Park, held a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs, and then we marched on Goldman Sachs and blocked the entrances until we were arrested. Faces appeared to me moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. Worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon learned in business schools and on trading floors effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside do not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us is filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. And it is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, or are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules. They make the system work, and they are rewarded for this in return. They do not question. We seem to have lost not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceits. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter, and without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots, and because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carried within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice, because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day. They come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.